Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Security Expo podcast, and I am your host, John Bigelow from Security Solutions Media, and we are talking today about water infrastructure, protecting the crown jewels and forging the path to a resilient water services infrastructure culture with Andrew Harris from GHD Advisory. Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, John.
Now, you've just presented on this upstairs, but for those people who weren't here, perhaps if you can begin by giving us a little bit of an overview of the main thrust of the presentation.
So there was a lot of ground that we covered all together, but I suppose the main thrust of the presentation was to cut through all the overwhelming concern about the existential dread facing a lot of people at this time in history, and particularly people in charge of managing large and complex infrastructure assets delivering critical services, and to offer a ray of light, or at least a ray of focus on what we can control and what we can do about it. So the work we did as GHD together with Central Coast Council was to set them up really to be able to control their critical water infrastructure asset security and resilience posture, I suppose. And I say security and resilience deliberately separately, but to be able to control that posture themselves over time as a community, not to have to rely on specialist security inputs all the time, because fundamentally the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, which is the legislation under which the work was conducted and where we help them reach compliance with these new requirements, fundamentally that's about putting risk down to the lowest possible level at which it can be managed, and that's by the community. So in effect, it's a community leadership, cultural change kind of exercise. And to me, that's a hopeful kind of note to focus on in an environment dominated by existential geopolitical threats to sea lines of communication, threats to social cohesion, all these things that are really not within the control of a regional water utility. But the things that are in their control are things like managing their spares, managing their chemical supply as much as possible, having good supply agreements, making sure that their people are aware of all the ways that they contribute to the security and resilience of the organization. And that's kind of what I wanted to leave people with, is that it's about empowering your organization to look after itself.
Yeah. So let's just go back a step. You mentioned specifically that you talk about security and resilience separately or individually. Why are you separating those two out specifically?
Mainly because when you say security, people think of bad actors. They think of people coming to do things deliberately badly. They think about graffiti on the treatment infrastructure. They think about those classical security kind of, capital S security kind of threats and scenarios. When you talk about resilience, people think about being able to withstand disruption and shocks. And the things that cause disruption and shocks are not necessarily security incidents, particularly in a place like Central Coast, which may have its fair share of nefarious types, but in reality, it's much more about flood, fire, and broader disruptions to critical spares and chemicals and fuel, and those aren't necessarily going to be security issues. But if you don't talk about security and resilience together, you don't capture all of that. So that's my preference when it's possible to think about both.
Yeah. Now, when you talk about protecting water critical infrastructure, that's a big task. I mean, there's a lot that goes into that, and I suppose a lot of people don't really think about just how important the water supply is. From the presentation, what were sort of, your top 3 or 4 things that people really need to be mindful of when they're thinking about this kind of protection?
So to summarize an answer to that, which as you've hinted at is quite a big problem, Christy ended the presentation by showing 2 things. One was it's simply about, for the community who uses the water treatment infrastructure, what are they going to put down their toilet? What are they going to pour in the drain?
Yeah.
And she was pretty explicit about what's supposed to go into the toilet. We all know what's supposed to go into the toilet, but people don't listen to that. If that causes a blockage in the network, then you actually disrupt service. So that's a really simple thing. A more complex thing was, I suppose, what you might call situational awareness in another context, but it's for the operators of the infrastructure themselves to develop an awareness of what's important, where it is, what it depends on, and to be able to have almost a dashboard level report as to where they need to focus their very often very limited OPEX and CAPEX. And between that, and between those two, with a very big picture and the very sort of grassroots intervention, is engaging the whole organization. So making sure they're aware of the role that they play. And that's as simple as making sure that people feel comfortable to speak up when they see something that could disrupt service and could interrupt infrastructure provision, rather water provision or sewer treatment. We're very used to talking about safety in that context. Safety moments, take 5. Many industries are very used to that now, and people will speak up if they see a cord to trip over or something like that. But they're not used to thinking about what's, an unsecured device, or someone's put their password on a post-it note, which are things that we see like routinely. Unsecured toxic chemicals like cyanide that aren't locked up, or things like that. Or just noticing unusual things like, why has that roll of copper wire disappeared again, and why has that SCADA system grown legs and walked away? What does that actually mean, rather than just sort of fixing it and not worrying about it? So it's the culture, it's the end user understanding what they can do to make sure they're actually going to protect their own infrastructure, and it's the whole of organizational awareness right up to the most senior levels of management to understand where the issues are and what they can do about it.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting segue into the next question, because when you talk about understanding the issues and what they are, I think it's fair to say that most people, when you talk about protecting water from a critical infrastructure point of view, would immediately jump to conclusions like, okay, well, someone's breached the SCADA control system and opened the local sewerage network and flooded the water supply, or, someone's poisoned the water supply by, slaughtering livestock and pushing them into the local catchment, or whatever it may be. But you mentioned before, it's about largely often the user and making sure that they're doing the right thing. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that before. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. So the user is sometimes the recreational fisherman on the dam.
Yep.
And they're out on the dam having a great time. Council's never really worried about it. And then maybe they are disenfranchised because they're not allowed to go and fish there anymore. And they might then no longer be an advocate for making sure that the dam is secure. But sometimes council, whichever council it is, not necessarily Central Coast Council, will work with that person to say, actually, we are going to allow fishing here over time, and that breach that you've made is no longer a breach, but we do ask you to do certain things. So in that way, you're kind of turning what was perceived as a hazard into something that's actually a protection, because you now have eyes on the water, in theory. But a more specific example is probably when people, you're asking me about when people put things down the toilet that they shouldn't.
Yeah, so I'm thinking things like, typically we as I said, we tend to think that it's going to be, we've seen a recent raising of the terrorist threat level from...
Oh, yeah, I understand.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, well, am I worried that a disenfranchised young 18-year-old guy is going to do the wrong thing? Or is it grandma putting her unused medication down the toilet?
So it's all of those things, in fact. And you mentioned the release of sewage through a compromised SCADA system, which is a real thing that happened some years ago in an Australian utility. And it was a disgruntled employee who was like, I'm going to rain hell upon the town, sort of thing. And, I was tempted to use more colourful language, but I won't. But you can imagine what it was like. And it's often that insider threat where you have a disgruntled person do that. But yeah, it's about people not flushing wet wipes down the toilet. I mean,
Yeah.
and it's about educating people that if they do that, they're actually going to disrupt their own sewage treatment. But at the same time, there is a threat of remote compromise, and that's something that is separate to the terror threat level going up. So, for example, like as part of our work, we did investigate whether or not there was an elevated level of. This was before the terror threat level was formally raised. But we did have to look at that as a potential hazard. Well, that's not happening really in the Central Coast. Like you might have somebody with a tinfoil hat think some crazy stuff and do some crazy stuff, but it's really, that's the lone wolf, sort of hard to pick up threat, and that's not something we can worry about. That goes into something, concern, not control. The importance of, as you mentioned, someone flushing their unused medication down is that that specific example, I don't know how much of what you would have to flush down, but part of the work that we did was to look at some of those things. And I go back to the cyanide example. So cyanide is used in water treatment, but if you pour it into the wrong bit of the water treatment infrastructure, people die. It's pretty simple. So it doesn't have to be someone doing it maliciously. It can be someone pouring some other disused chemical, a pesticide, for example. That's one thing that's a real example that we had to deal with. If someone pours the wrong kind of pesticide in the wrong part of the system, people will die, or they may end up killing the bacteria that treat the water that then enable the sewage to be treated to a certain level. Like there's all sorts of stuff like that. And I didn't finish my chemical engineering degree. I did most of it. I ended up doing other things. So I work with engineers, chemical engineers, who can make sure that we're doing things technically correctly. But at the strategic level, it's about understanding where those points of control are. So stuff goes in the hole, only certain stuff goes in the hole. Simple.
Yeah. And so from the protection of the critical infrastructure piece, I mean, what seems to be the greatest threat? Because you mentioned control versus concern earlier, and I think that's a very valid point. Are we more worried about the insider threat? Are we more worried about, user challenges? Or are we more worried about, external attacks? Or is it a little bit of everything and just in varying scales?
We're worried about everything as human beings, as we all rely on water, for example. But in terms of what we should professionally worry ourselves about, supply chain to me is the worst problem, because it's wicked, complicated, outside of our control, relies on so many other things. In 2021, we did a big study into water treatment, chemical supply chain resilience for the federal government. In 2022, we did a big study into emerging threats to the energy grid, primarily related to renewable energy. And then 2023, 2024, my team has been focused on helping the federal government establish a maritime strategic fleet capability. This is in the public domain. All of that's more or less in the public domain, not the details. The fact is, those are all the big interdependencies. Water relies on chemicals, which is a supply chain issue. Energy actually relies on components, which are a supply chain issue, but water relies on energy. And then fundamentally, everything relies on shipping.
Yep.
So without an understanding of, or at least a real-time understanding of how far away your critical spares or inputs are and how they might be disrupted, and what you can do about stockpiling, substitution, and having a war chest to buy things at an inflated price if it comes to that. Without all of that sort of complexity of measures and an understanding of what supply chain means to your organization, then you will be unable to deal with it. The cascading impact is also to those who depend on you. But upstream, it's who do you depend on? So bringing it back to the presentation today, Central Coast Council's water and sewer operation supplies Gosford Hospital.
Yep.
The hospital has a certain fault tolerance. The water and sewer utility needs to understand that fault tolerance, and they actually need to work together to lessen the opportunity for there to be a misunderstanding. And if, for example, something terrible happens and the chlorine supply is disrupted, then they'll know to let the hospital know, because it will take this amount of time for it to flow through the system, and the fault tolerance has been negotiated and everyone can maintain continuity. So I think the biggest worry is supply chain, but it's who do you connect to and who connects to you. And it's also informing your board about what is the cost of not doing the right thing. No one wants to stockpile things they're not going to use until they wish they had a stockpile. And one of the critical spares we identified was of basically infinitesimally small commercial value. And it had been overlooked because people were like, this thing is 50 cents, we'll just buy it whenever we need it. But years later, those had deteriorated and you couldn't buy them anymore. I mean, again, we found a workaround. That was the point of our job. But unless you ask those questions, and again, unless people feel safe to answer them, then you can't appreciate the problem, and it often comes down to supply chain. So, and that also, and supply chain then links to all your other hazards. Where do you buy your physical security measures from? Where do you buy your cyber measures? Where do you buy your control systems? In which countries do all of the managed service providers' data centers sit? I have the luxury a lot of the time of working with federal government departments and agencies where this is all second nature. There's security zoning, there's all the right maturity frameworks, everyone gets it, it's core business. But out where it really matters a lot of the time, this maturity is not there, and it's not their core business. It's about right-sizing their understanding and the solution to make sure they can deliver what they need.
How important is it in that sort of critical infrastructure protection piece to understand the second and third order effects of downstream sort of suppliers? So obviously you're going to have people who might provide maintenance, or people who might provide chemicals, or people who might even just simply store chemicals, and all those sorts of things, and understanding who they are and who they deal with and how they manage things. And those, you sitting here smiling at me.
So chlorine is a central issue in Australia. We do manufacture most of, or really all of, the chlorine we need to use in Australia. Again, that's on the public record. But it's not as simple as that. It's who are the transport companies who are bringing your chlorine? What are the vessels in which they're bringing you the chlorine? Where are they from? How are they assured? Are they actually delivering to you the standard of chlorine that you've asked for? Who are the people doing the independent testing of that? How safe is the provision of chlorine? It explodes, it kills people, it's extremely hazardous, it's very difficult to transport. You can't stockpile chlorine easily because those become major hazard facilities. But you need to balance that safety with security sometimes, and resilience, which is difficult. It's in our case, we were asking questions of who are the delivery drivers from the companies? Who owns the transport companies? Where do their boards sit? Which countries invest in them? We know who owns the chlorine manufacturing plant, and part of it isn't local ownership. That we deemed as not something necessarily relevant in this context, but it was more because there's one supplier. I think that's well known. The point is, one manufacturer, I should say, not one supplier. But with chlorine, the issue is then the second order concerns from the manufacturing who is transporting it. But the transport companies are trying to do things as efficiently as possible and not necessarily as securely as possible. And, it's about understanding to what degree can you actually speak to those organizations, to what degree can you influence that, and then to what degree can you enshrine your concerns in the contract. So fortunately, ASIO has out on its outreach portal Security Manager's Guide to Supply Chain Security. And that has some specific contractual clauses that can be used and are very neatly drafted because they draft things very well. And pretty much anyone can access that once they've gone through the very limited vetting process. So it's at a low level of classification and it's available to help. And that's all you really need. You need to be able to understand things, how they affect you. You don't need to understand necessarily why. So in terms of foreign ownership of, say, the transport company, for example, or the logistics organization that's delivering your critical chemicals, it's not necessarily that there's going to be interference and espionage and something spooky happening. It's simply that maybe it's not their core business to service regional Australian utilities, and maybe there's another organization whose core business it is to do that, and perhaps you should switch your primary contract to an organization who really cares about what you care about. And maybe you can nominate which drivers, and maybe you can say that they need to have checks, because you can negotiate whatever you want if possible, you know.
Yep.
So it's about understanding what the levers are and what you can ask for. Yeah.
So, in closing, because we're drawing to the end of our time, you know, we're talking about all of this in the context of critical infrastructure and water protection, but these principles apply to any kind of supply chain security, really, don't they? So whether I'm an Amazon or whether I'm a local printing company or whether I simply provide food for the local, homeless shelter, whatever it may be, what in your experience are the top sort of 3 or 4 things that I need to take away and think about when I'm talking about, you know, supply chain and protection of risk?
Know your suppliers, build trust with your suppliers, understand who are your critical suppliers, what are your critical inputs, and think about workarounds as well. Do a bit of scenario planning. What's going to happen if I can't get it? What am I going to substitute it with? Will my systems manage with a different product, or will we require some sort of adaptation? And try to stockpile things, because you know it's all about being ready at a moment's notice to deploy something that you won't have otherwise.
Yeah. And I guess it's equally important to, based on what you were saying before about control versus concern, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's important to be aware of the black swan events, but don't let them drive everything that you're doing.
Particularly given that we now have a flock of black swans.
Yeah.
And that nothing surprises anyone anymore. I mean, the bigger concerns really are things like solar flares, things that would knock out communications. That's what keeps me and a lot of my clients up at night, is a lack of communications, a lack of internet access. Otherwise, as long as you've got communications, and I guess power a lot of the time can knock out communications, but if it's set up right, you can have resilience. I suppose, and you lost your question. We might need to just revisit that. It's been a long day.
We were talking about, you know, the importance of being aware of the black swan kind of events, but not
letting
allowing them
dominate.
dictate.
Yeah. So you can be aware of a solar flare, but really, like, that's so hard to predict and such a high catastrophic consequence that and impact that you're not going to let that consume you. What you might do is just make sure that the shared risk of many of those big black swanish events, which is comms, that you have some redundancy. That's where I was trying to get to with my ramble, is to say, at Central Coast, for example, again, to bring it back to the presentation, we asked them, what will you do if your mobile phone towers go down? And they said, we use our radios. And we said, where are your radios? How many of them are there? Do they have batteries in them? Who knows how to use them? Have you trained people? It's that simple.
Yeah.
So I think it's just about working out, not necessarily which event are you concerned about, but which is the shared impact that you can do something about. So any number of things can disrupt shipping, which is my favorite subject at the moment, but it's about what are you going to do if shipping is disrupted? And that is the spirit of the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act legislation. It's about reducing this concern about the flock of black swans to what is material risk to you, what risk is material to you rather, and material risk has a legislative definition, but also what can you do so far as it is reasonably practical to mitigate that risk to maintain continuity of operations?
Andrew, that has been fantastic advice, and thank you very much. If people want to know more about GHD Advisory or your work, where do they go?
GHD.com, but feel free to get directly in touch with me. It's just andrew.harris@ghd.com, and you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm usually fairly responsive as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the Security Expo. Thank you.